Charles, welcome and thank you for stopping in at DeakinPrime on your whistle-stop tour to Australia. Just going to fire a few quick questions if that's okay.
Certainly.
I know you often ask groups you talk to where their most impactful learning occurred. What's the answer you typically get to that question?
Well, I've asked that question of many, many people over the years, and the vast majority of people say that the most impactful learning experiences they've ever had has been part of doing work. So it's in the workplace, and it's either through having a great mentor or having a very challenging experience, working on a project that worked really well or didn't work really well. And I found it interesting because when we think about learning and development, we tend to think about structured learning and development, but when we talk to people, the vast majority will say that the great learning experiences they have is part of the workflow, not part of structured learning and development.
So given that is the case, how does that impact how we should think about solving workplace performance challenges where they involve people?
Well, Simon, for me it feeds into a fact. And the fact is that the closer to the context of where the learning is going to be used, that learning occurs, the more powerful it is. So if we can learn as near as the point of time we want to use it, obviously we don't have that facility often, where we can learn at the point of need, but at least as close to the point of need as possible. It's going to have greater impact. It's very often cheaper in order to do it. And it just is a better way to do it. And that's why with 70-20-10, I talk about planning for the 100, but actually when we start to look at developing and implementing, we should start at the 70 and work inwards, because the 70 and the 20 are really where the learning is in the context of the workplace. So, and that's where the impact is, and it's close to the point of need.
Yep. And you mentioned earlier Accenture have recently decided to give away the annual performance review cycle. Do you see that as a trend? Is it a good move? Are we seeing the demise of the annual performance review?
Yeah, it's Accenture's just the last of quite a few that have decided that the annual cycle isn't fast enough and isn't doing its job that it was set out to do, and have moved to ensure that reviews occur on a much more regular basis, so that every time a manager sits down with their report, they carry out effectively a performance review there. And I think that there's going to have some significant implications in that change. So if we don't carry out annual performance reviews, or if the focus isn't on annual performance reviews as it was in the past, that has implication for processes, certain HR processes, such as talent identification and talent workshops and so on. It has implications for how we design or how we utilise development and how we design development objectives. So again, the idea of creating annual development objectives starts to be called into question, because and it's all being driven by the fact that change is occurring so fast that we need to be much more responsive. So setting a set of objectives and reviewing performance on an annual basis just isn't fast enough to what's needed.
And I've heard you talk about a fairly simple set of 3 questions that managers can use in those conversations. Would you mind just taking us through what those are?
Yeah, the 3 questions that I often suggest that people use and get their managers to use in their one-to-one meetings with their reports. And they're really questions to help people utilise reflective practice, basically. And the questions are these. The first question is simply, tell me what you've been doing since we last met. What are the challenges you've been facing? What are the successes you've had? Just step back and reflect for a minute around what's been going on for you. The second question is, well, having reflected there, what would you do differently to get different outcomes? And the third question is, well, what learnings come out of that? So they're just 3 simple trigger questions to encourage reflective practice. And in fact, they've come from the military. Do this really well. The military with their after-action reviews, and it doesn't really matter what military from what nation you have, they pretty well all have after-action reviews. The American military after-action reviews work in a similar way. They have 4 questions. Their 4 questions are, what do we set out to do? What happened? Why did it happen? What will we do next time? So very, very similar. And it's a very, very simple little technique to turn a one-to-one meeting with a manager and a report from a purely operational meeting into an operational and a development meeting as well. So to utilise that opportunity to to reflect on how it's going and what would work next time and what learnings come out of that. And then again, I've seen organisations use that where they gather that in a more structured way through a learning log or something like that, and then use that as part of deciding what sort of development objectives are agreed and how they go forward in that.
Right, okay. And I think we've seen the 70-20-10 approach becoming a lot more mainstream or certainly well known within organisations. But what are some of the misconceptions that you think are out there? And for you, at its essence, what is 70-20-10?
Well, 70-20-10 is an interesting animal in that one of the challenges is that it's not about the numbers, and yet it's all numbers. So it's really getting above the numbers. The numbers come from a small study some years ago, which when successful managers were asked how they got to be successful, they said, well, about 70% of my success comes from tough assignments, from experience and practice and reflection, and about 20% from other people. In fact, in the original study, it was mainly the boss, and about 10% from courses and reading. And of course, if we focus just on the percentages, we miss the point. Because what it's really about, what 70-20-10 for me is really about, it's about extending learning into the workflow and utilising experiential learning and social learning as much as we utilise structured learning. And it's really around, I think it's a holistic model in that the sum of the parts, so the sum is greater than each of the parts. So if we start to think about how we solve business problems and performance problems, that if we focus first on what we can do to help in the workplace, so we start on the 17-20, and then if we find that we don't have solutions that will solve the problems there, we then look at how we can do it in a structured way. That's the way to do it, because invariably the learning that occurs in the workplace is going to be more immediate and actually more impactful and probably less costly, in fact. So that's one aspect of it. I think the other aspect of it is when we look at structured development, using a 70-20-10 mindset really helps us think about our structured development in terms of not just taking people away from work, putting them through a program and putting them back into work and hoping that change has occurred, because often it doesn't in that environment. It's thinking about how do we take our structured development and extend that and link that into activities in the workplace. So I've seen organisations, for example, cut down their structured development processes or cut down taking people away from work for so long and actually implement things such as action learning in the workplace or other sorts of processes and utilisation of tools and so on in the workplace.
Fantastic. And finally, you've just published a new book at this stage in Dutch, but yes, yeah. English coming soon. You've identified some new roles to support the 70-20-10 strategy. Would you mind just taking us through what those are?
Yeah, sure. I work with a couple of Dutch colleagues, which is why we published it in Dutch initially, and incidentally, the Dutch version got into the top 50 business books in the Netherlands almost immediately. In fact, it was awarded the best learning and development book in Europe by an organisation in Belgium this year, so we're quite pleased about that. But it is coming out very soon in English. And what we've looked at there, and it's called 70-20-10 towards 100% performance, so it's focused absolutely on performance. And what we've done there is redefined some roles, or define some roles that are needed to support the 70-20-10 model, 70-20-10 thinking. And the roles are very different to traditional L&D roles because they're all about performance. So there is a performance detective who does the detective work and the analysis, and they don't do training needs analysis, but the performance detective will do the business analysis. What is the business problem? The performance analysis. What is the performance problem? And the root cause analysis. In other words, what are the root causes of the problem? So we can really get to make sure that the solutions are addressing the real problems. Then there are other roles such as the architect, the performance architect. And I think the 70-20-10 really requires an architecture rather than a simple solution. Rather than just building a course or a program, we need to architect a set of solutions. There's obviously a need to build, so there's a performance master builder who pulls together the solution and does the hard work. And in fact, the tasks, we've defined sets of tasks and workflows for each of these roles, and the master builder is the major one in that there are many more tasks for them to do. Then there's a new role called a performance game changer. which is very much around how do you embed the change that this is going to produce. And often that role won't sit within learning and development, it might sit within corporate comms or internal marketing, or it might be a hybrid role. But that's really around how we can take 70-20-10 to drive campaigns rather than simply driving courses. And the last role is the performance tracker. And again, that's how we utilise the right metrics, how we identify the right metrics and use them, such as the KPIs, and really focus on the stakeholder metrics. So the whole piece is just rethinking the way in which we support high performance and build high performance. And in order to do that, we need to not only think differently, but also structure ourselves differently and have different processes in order to do it.
I love the sound of it, and I can't wait to read it in English.
Oh, great.
So thank you very much for your visit, and we look forward to spending some time with you again in 2016.
It's been a real pleasure, Simon.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very much for the invitation. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Good.